In today's lesson, we'll be looking at the legacy of Canada's residential schools. For over 100 years, Indigenous children were taken from their homes, their culture, and their way of life, and placed in residential schools run by churches all over Canada, under the guidance and legislation of the federal government. While some Canadians were experiencing progress, Indigenous peoples were experiencing decline. Indigenous veterans who served in the wars were not recognized. Canadian women had been given the right to vote, but Indigenous peoples whose families had been here for thousands of years still had no say. Child labor laws across Canada were created, and child labor was deemed illegal, yet Indigenous children were taken from their homes and forced to learn skills to survive in the modern world. This is the story of residential schools. In this lesson, you will learn more about the history of residential schools in Canada, as well as their lasting legacy and impact on Indigenous communities to this day. And throughout this lesson, we'll be trying to answer the following questions. What is the relationship between the Government of Canada and Indigenous people? What were residential schools? What was life like in residential schools? What have been the consequences of residential schools? And what has been done to redress residential schools? In order to understand the history of residential schools, we have to look at the relationship between Indigenous peoples and the Government of Canada. And this goes back a long, long ways. Maybe we trace this all the way back to when Europeans first started coming over to the Americas in the 1500s with people like Jacques Cartier and Samuel de Champlain. This sort of relationship has been developing for hundreds of years. But in Canada, where a lot of our legal relationship comes from is through, for one, from treaties between individual nations in Canada, and in particular the Indian Act of 1876. This is the piece of legislation that governs the relationship between the Government of Canada and Indigenous peoples throughout the country. Now, it's important to remember when we talk about the Indian Act and we talk about First Nations, is that, for one thing, Indigenous peoples are a diverse group of people. They're not a singular group. There are hundreds of different First Nations with their own cultures and languages and traditions that are very different from one another. The other thing we have to remember is that First Nations people are not citizens of Canada in the same way that other people are citizens of Canada. First Nations people, their relationship with the government is slightly different. So the idea is supposed to be that they are sort of their own nations that exist within Canada on a separate but equal footing with the federal government, and they have a relationship with one another. In practice, that's not really what's happened over the last 150 years, though, and many rights that have been negotiated between First Nations and the federal government have been taken away or ignored by the Government of Canada. Now, getting back to the Indian Act is a very important piece of legislation because it defines who is considered to be, quote, Indian. Although we don't use that term anymore because it's a misnomer, that's the official terminology that's used in this act. And this is really important because being a status Indian gives you many rights that other Canadians wouldn't have. Things like rights to the land or rights to hunting and fishing, rights to live on reserves, etc., etc. But in order to get that Indian status, you have to fulfill a number of conditions. So one of those conditions was sending your children to residential schools. And the idea of this was that it was to assimilate or make Indigenous peoples as white as possible. There were many other conditions attached to this. So, for example, you were only allowed to vote for a very long time, up until the 1960s, only if you gave up your status as a status Indian. So status Indians cannot vote until, only a few decades ago. And we can look at a long chronology of First Nations relationships and this idea of assimilation that had been passed on from the federal government. We could take it back even farther to 1857, where the Gradual Civilization Act was passed to assimilate Native people into Canada. From the 1870s to the 1910s, there was a period of assimilation where the clear objective of both missionaries and the government was to assimilate Aboriginal children into the lower fringes of mainstream society. By 1920, there was compulsory attendance for all children ages 7 to 15 in these residential schools, and children were forcibly taken from their families by priests, agents, and police officers. By 1931, there were 80 residential schools operating in Canada. By 1948, there were 72, and they had close to 10,000 students. By 1979, there were down to 12 residential schools in Canada with about 1,900 students. And by the 1980s, there were many stories coming out from those who had attended residential schools in the preceding decades, with disclosing stories of sexual and physical and mental abuse that occurred at these schools. So over time, sort of the government's position on these schools starts to change. There's a very negative association with them. By 1996, the last federally run residential school that had operated in Saskatchewan was closed. But that's still relatively recently in our past. That's only 20 years ago. 20 years ago is, not, there are many, many, many people alive in Canada today who were alive when there were still residential schools. So this is a very recent part of our past and a relatively recent part of our history. And so as a result of that, a lot of the long-term consequences of this program are still unfolding. Now, the first residential schools were set up in the 1890s by Christian missionaries. Their goal was to Christianize and educate the natives and to get them to read the Bible. So again, this is this idea of, taking the savage, as they would think of them, and civilizing them by giving them Christian values and teaching them English and teaching them Western education. The government helped support residential schools as far back as 1874. And in 1856, the first Indian Act was enacted, which gave the federal government the authority to create the Ministry of the Department of Indian Affairs to control Indian education. Now, where were these residential schools located? They were located all throughout Canada in all but 3 provinces. You can see on this map here, the black dots represent where these schools were located. Now, although they were located throughout Canada, for the most part, they were located in remote areas. It wasn't like these were being set up in the middle of big cities. For the most part, these were off in rural areas, hours away from big cities. And the only Canadian provinces where there weren't residential schools were PEI. Again, PEI is the smallest province. Kind of makes sense that there weren't any there. New Brunswick, and then Newfoundland. Newfoundland did not join Confederation until 1949, so they kind of came in at the tail end of when this program had started. In total, there were 130 residential schools that were operated at one time or another by the government. And the government of Canada officially took over residential schools on April 1st, 1941. So before that point, they had been run separately by Christian churches. By 1941, the federal government assumes full responsibility for these schools. Most schools were closed down by the mid-1970s, but as discussed before, the last school was not closed until 1996. And the idea of this program was overtly to assimilate Indigenous peoples. There was nothing subversive about this. That is the clear intended goal of this program from the very start. So here's a quote from one Christian missionary who ran one of these schools, a superintendent from an all-girls school. It's a quote from 1877. And she's talking about Indigenous peoples. She says about them, "They are in general very lazy, even more so than the Negroes, who have a great heat as their excuse. But the Indians living in the most healthy climate in the world, in a bracing air, have only neglected their mental as well as their bodily powers, and a good discipline is wanted to change them in a lapse of time to really useful working people." So we can see here the really obvious racism going on. I mean, she's not even, this is the casually mentioning that, Indigenous peoples are even more lazy than the quote Negroes, as she calls them. So just kind of the blatant, overt racism going on here. And that's the way that a lot of these people would have thought of Indigenous peoples back then, as being less than them, as being lower, as being less human. And we can clearly see that in this quote. Now, the Indian Act stated that it was mandatory for status Indians to attend residential school. Children started going as young as 6 years of age, and they would be removed forcefully from their families to attend these schools. And these were not sort of like your typical day schools where you go to school for a few hours, you go from 8 till 3, and then you go home at night. These were more like a boarding school where you went off into the wilderness. You might be hours or days away from where your family lives. And they would stay there for up to 10 months every year. And in fact, in some cases, when children lived in really remote areas, The children didn't even get to go home over the summer, and they had to stay at the schools for the entire year. Some of these children might have gone years without seeing their families. Now, with that in mind, let's have a look at what life was like for students in residential schools. In residential schools, students could not speak their own languages. They could not practice any traditional cultural activities. They could not speak to their family members. And if they were caught doing any of these things, they would be physically punished. When students arrived, they were given one set of school clothes and one set of work clothes, and they were assigned daily chores. When they arrived, both boys and girls were forced to cut their hair short, and children were given new European names that they had to go by. Now, here's a quote from a native elder, Agnes Snow, talking about residential schools. She says, "At the mission, the truck backed up and off we went. Right away, boys were separated from girls. We were lined up, sat on chairs, and had our long, beautiful braided hair chopped off. We were thrown into the shower, then had DDT sprinkled all over. It stunk. They gave me a number, 79. My name was gone. I was only a number now. We all had the same little bundle of clothing. Pinafores, back clothes, socks. You couldn't tell one kid from the other. They transformed individuals into a group. I don't understand how my Shuswap language was turned into English in just one day." So again, there's lots going on here in this quote, but sort of one parallel that sort of eerily is drawn here is almost the similarities to the stories of Holocaust survivors when they were taken to concentration camps. Again, the purpose of residential schools was different. It wasn't overtly to exterminate native peoples, but we can see a lot of the same tactics being used. Sort of the taking away their identity and turning them into a number, sort of lining them up on trucks, like the Jewish people were lined up on trains and taken to concentration camps, the taking them to a shower, the cutting off of their hair. There's lots of really eerie similarities here. So even though the overt intent was not the same, again, we can see the process being somewhat similar, which is eerie in a number of ways. A typical day for a student at residential school might look something like this. At 5:30 in the morning, the boys got up to do morning chores, such as milking the cows and feeding animals. At 6 a.m., everyone else got up and washed themselves. They then had breakfast, which consisted of a hard porridge made the night before with a piece of bread and milk. Then there were morning cleaning chores. Then there was 3 hours of classes, 1 hour of religious studies, and 2 hours of academic studies. There was then a lunch, which might have consisted of something like mashed potatoes, carrots, turnips, cabbage, and meat chunks. That doesn't sound very appetizing. Then there were more chores and work time. Afterwards, there was study hour, supper, cleanup, short recreation time, time for prayers, and then bedtime. So you can see it's a very structured day for these students. They're not being given lots of time to themselves. Remember, this is for 10 months of the year, sort of the same routine day after day after day. And so some milestones in residential school history. By 1930, 75% of treaty Indian children between the ages of 7 and 16 were enrolled in residential schools. Stunningly, in some residential schools, the mortality rate was between 30 and 60% of students. So just to be clear, that means that in some of these residential schools, especially in these far-off areas, the death rate was between 30 and 60% of the students who came to those schools died before graduating, which is just an insane number to think about. By 1948, the rules were changed to allow children to go home at Christmas time to see their parents. So again, even these sort of mild reforms that are being made are sort of just like the least that can be done. So here are some examples of what these schools would have looked like. At Sioux Lookout, Ontario, here's a residential school that was opened in 1911 and closed in 1973. Again, we can see it's just off in the middle of nowhere. It might be hours and hours and hours between this school and the next major city. Inside the school, this is what the living quarters would have looked like. You can see all of the beds very close together. Here's what the classrooms would have looked like. Again, sort of lots of students in a single class with a teacher. And again, these aren't necessarily, for the most part, teachers who have been trained in teaching. These are often Christian missionaries and nuns who are conducting the classes. So these aren't even necessarily teachers who are specialized in subjects giving these classes. There's a real emphasis on religious education here. Here's a class confirmation, so the Catholic rite of confirmation, where they confirm their membership in the Catholic Church. So again, a huge focus on religion in these schools. And in this picture here, a very famous picture, we can see the transformation of what happened to Indigenous peoples at these schools. The picture on the same boy in both pictures. On the left is before, the right's after. So we can see on the left, we have the boy with sort of long braided hair, wearing traditional garments. You can see on the right, that's all changed. He has short hair. He's wearing very formal, British-looking clothes. He's standing with, very formal, proper posture. He's posed for this photograph. It's kind of interesting because in both photographs it looks like he's posed, because on the one on the left here, looks like he's holding some sort of prop gun. So they're both very posed photos. But we can look into this and see not only what the messaging of taking these photos might have been, but also what's happened to this individual. They've become westernized. They've become Europeanized. So that all that identity and culture that might have been, that we might see in them on the left side, has been taken away from them on the right side. We could also look at things such as gender norms that were taught to these students here. So the division of labor was quite gendered at residential schools. So here we have a class where girls are being taught how to sew. While on the other hand, boys were often given hard labor jobs. So here we have boys out picking potatoes and doing other farm work. Now, one of the most tragic stories about residential schools is that many of these children never returned home. Some children ran away and never returned. Again, these are out in the middle of nowhere, so children might have ran away, young children trying to go back to their families. They might not know where they're going. It might just be so far from their house that, again, running away in the middle of winter in northern Canada, there's lots of dangers in that. So many children died due to that. Also, disease spread easily because of the poor living conditions. So there were often things like cholera outbreaks. So this picture on the right here is a girl who died during a cholera outbreak that struck her school in 1907. It's estimated that there are about 9,000 survivors left in Canada today, but every year this number decreases as many of them are in their late 70s. Many of them suffered physical abuse and for others mental abuse, and some survivors tell horrible stories such as staff physically and sexually abusing them. When they grew up, survivors of residential schools suffered many long-term consequences such as higher rates of substance abuse, anxiety, depression, and aggressive behavior. And many continued this cycle of abuse with their own children. They might have had parental deficiencies, meaning they didn't know how to parent because they did not have those role models in their own lives. So they were taken away from their parents, they can't model that behavior, and the adult role models they did have in their lives would, resort to punishing them physically if they did something wrong, or, again, all these stories about physical, sexual, emotional abuse that went on. They lost their language, culture, and identity. Many have a distrust of the government and schools, and for many there's a feeling of alienation, like they don't fit in anymore. And so here's an example of a sample of 127 survivors of residential schools from BC. 90% experienced sexual abuse at residential schools. 3/4 of them reported that they had abused alcohol. Half of the subjects reported they had a criminal record, and 31% reported that they had assaulted police officers. Only 2 of the participants did not suffer from at least one diagnosable mental health disorder. The most common mental health disorders included PTSD, substance abuse disorder, and depression. Now, in 2008, the Canadian government, the Assembly of First Nations, and churches agreed to sign an agreement of principle to financially apologize to the survivors. Prime Minister Stephen Harper delivered a formal apology in the House of Commons, and The survivors were given a total payment of $1.9 billion to be divided amongst them. And how much each individual got was based on how many years they attended residential school. So in summary, in this lesson you learned that the Indian Act of 1876 is the document that outlines the relationship between Indigenous people and the Government of Canada. As part of the Indian Act, residential schools were created to assimilate Indigenous people into Canada. Indigenous children were forced to attend residential schools, and life in residential schools was brutal, with high rates of disease, physical and sexual abuse, and death. Survivors of residential schools have high rates of mental health issues such as PTSD, depression, and anxiety. In 2008, the Canadian government formally apologized for residential schools and paid $1.9 billion in redress to survivors.